The wind had been relentless all evening, howling through the trees like a living thing. In the small town of Pine Hollow, Michigan, December nights were always long and bitter, but this one carried a strange weight, as though the darkness had teeth. A thick layer of snow covered the ground, and the roads leading into town were nearly impassable. Most locals had already locked themselves inside, but Dave and Claire Simmons had made a mistake. They decided to drive back from their late shift at the factory, thinking they could make it home before the storm got worse. They were halfway along Willow Creek Road when the first problem appeared. At first, it was just a flicker of headlights in the distance, but soon the headlights were following them, keeping pace despite their speed. Dave frowned. "Must be someone else driving slow in this storm," he muttered. But as they continued, the lights didn't pass. They stayed behind, sometimes closer, sometimes a little farther back, but never disappearing. Claire tightened her grip on the seatbelt. "Dave, they've been following us for a while. Shouldn't we, I don't know, pull over?" Dave shook his head. "Let's just get home." His voice was calm, but his hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The road twisted through dense forest on both sides. Snow fell in thick sheets, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. And then the car in the distance did something impossible. It didn't pass. They didn't move at all, but the headlights blinked out as if someone had reached up and shut them off. Claire gasped. "Did they disappear?" Dave shook his head. "I don't know. Just keep driving." Moments later, they hit a patch of black ice. The car skidded, fishtailing wildly. Dave fought to regain control, but it was no use. The car slammed into a snowbank, spinning them around. When it finally stopped, they were off the road, headlights pointed toward a thicket of pines. The storm seemed louder now, as if it were pressing in, the wind rattling the car's frame like an angry animal. Dave tried the engine. Nothing. Claire checked her phone. No signal. Panic started to creep in. They were completely alone, trapped in the middle of a storm, with something, or someone, following them. Then came the sound, not the wind, not the snow, a faint scratching like nails on metal coming from the back of the car. Both of them froze. "Dave, do you hear that?" Claire whispered. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Probably a branch, the wind." But the sound persisted, growing louder, moving around the car. It scratched along the roof, along the trunk, and then stopped. Silence fell, thick and heavy. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the windshield, a shadow moved. Not a tree, not a snowdrift. Something human-shaped, tall and thin, hunched over slightly. Claire screamed and reached for the door handle, but the doors were frozen shut. Dave grabbed her arm. Stay calm. It's probably nothing." The shadow didn't move closer, didn't run. It just stood there at the edge of the snowbank, staring. And then another appeared. And another. They began to surround the car, moving with an unnatural grace, gliding over the snow. Dave felt his stomach drop. "We have to get out of here. We have to run." Claire shook her head. "We can't. It's freezing, and it's deep snow. We'll never make it." They stayed in the car for what felt like hours, huddled together, listening to the crunch of snow around them, the scraping of invisible claws. Then one of the shadows stepped forward into the dim glow of the headlights. Its face was pale, stretched unnaturally, like the skin had been pulled too tight over a skull. Its eyes, they weren't eyes, just black holes that seemed to suck the light from the storm. The shadows began moving closer, circling the car, their movements silent but deliberate. Dave tried the horn. Nothing. He pounded on the steering wheel. The shadows flinched but did not retreat. The air around them grew colder, biting, cutting through the thin layers of their clothing. "Dave, what do we do?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. He had no answer. They were trapped in the middle of nowhere with something that shouldn't exist. The shadows began tapping on the car windows, slow, rhythmic, like they were testing the glass. Then one leaned down, pressing its face to the windshield. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, and a sound came out that wasn't human. A hollow, keening scream that seemed to shake the air. Claire's scream joined it, and Dave felt his own voice fail him. They were surrounded. And then the shadows vanished. Just like that. One moment they were there, circling the car, pressing against it. The next, nothing. Silence, save for the wind and the snow. Dave risked looking out the window. The snow had smoothed over their tracks. The road ahead looked normal, as if they had never spun out. His heart raced. Maybe we imagined it, but when he turned to reassure Claire, he saw it. Footprints. Not normal footprints. They were too long, too deep, stretching unnaturally through the snow, leading into the forest. And at the edge of the trees, something moved. A tall, thin figure, watching, waiting. They didn't sleep that night. They didn't move. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world coated in thick, blinding white. They trudged back to the main road, shaken but unharmed. They told no one what happened. Who would believe them? A storm, a few hallucinations, that was all. But Pine Hollow had its own warnings. Local legends spoke of the Wendigo, a spirit of hunger and cold, a creature that could appear human at first, then twist into something else in the shadows of the forest. Most dismissed it as old folklore. But Dave and Claire never forgot what they had seen. The black-eyed faces, the impossible shapes, the way the wind had sounded like it was alive. Weeks later, Dave went back to the scene with a friend who knew the woods. They followed the tracks. Only the first few steps remained. The rest had vanished, erased by wind and snow. But at the edge of the forest, they found something else. A small circle of broken branches, scorched and blackened, with claw marks pressed into the trunks of trees. And in the center, a single footprint. Too long, too wide, human-shaped but grotesque, pointing back toward the road. No one came back from the forest alone after that winter. People whispered about strange noises, missing hikers, and vehicles found abandoned on icy roads. The local sheriff refused to investigate some calls, claiming frostbite or poor visibility. But those who had been there knew the truth. Something was out there, something that walked the snow like it owned it. Every December, when the snow comes down thick and the wind carries the sound of the trees creaking, Dave and Claire feel it again. They hear footsteps in the snow outside their windows, always circling, always patient. They know it's waiting, and they know someday it might come for them again. Some people think it's just winter madness, the cold playing tricks on the mind. But those who've seen the eyes, the unnatural limbs, the way the shadows move, they know better. Pine Hollow has its own winter terror, and it doesn't care who you are or how fast you drive. Story the end. The wind had been howling for hours, tearing across the plains of northern Minnesota, carrying with it snow so thick that the world outside looked like a white void. Craig Lawson had been driving for nearly 6 hours, trying to make it back to his family's cabin in the woods before nightfall. The storm had come suddenly, the kind that gave no warning, and now it was too late to turn back. His old truck struggled through the snowdrifts, tires spinning against icy patches, headlights barely cutting through the swirling white. He finally saw the dark outline of the cabin in distance, a solitary shape surrounded by trees weighed down with snow. Relief flooded him, but it was tempered by an unease he couldn't shake. Something about the silence between gusts of wind felt wrong. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the whistle of the wind and the crunch of his tires in the snow. Craig stepped out of the truck, his boots sinking into the deep snow. He unlocked the cabin door and was greeted by the warm smell of cedar and the faint dust of disuse. It had been a few months since he last came here, and the place felt like it had been holding its breath in his absence. He set his bag down and went straight to the fireplace, lighting a fire and watching the flames struggle to fill the cold room with warmth. As night fell, the storm outside intensified. Craig ate a quick dinner and then tried to distract himself with some reading, but the wind was deafening. Then came the sound, a low thumping, rhythmic, and deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing around the cabin. At first he thought it was just the storm, branches banging against each other, but the sound continued, steady and methodical, like someone or something was walking slowly around the cabin. Craig froze, straining to hear. The thumping stopped, a pause. Then a dragging sound, something heavy being pulled across the snow. He rushed to the window, peering into the darkness, but the snowstorm had transformed the world into an impenetrable wall of white. The headlights from his truck outside reflected faintly off the snow, and for a fleeting second he thought he saw movement, a dark shape, hunched, moving from tree to tree at the edge of the clearing. Heart pounding, Craig grabbed the hunting rifle he kept near the fireplace. He paced back and forth, ears straining for the slightest sound. The storm made everything surreal, every shadow larger, every noise distorted. And then he heard it. A voice, whispering his name from somewhere outside. Craig. He spun around, shining the flashlight toward the door. Nothing. The voice came again, closer, more insistent. Craig? It wasn't human. It was hoarse, wet, and guttural, almost as if the snow itself were speaking through it. Panic clawed at him. He checked the locks, made sure the windows were shut, but the sound didn't stop. The whispering moved, circling the cabin. The air grew colder, far colder than it should have been. His breath came out in thick clouds, freezing before it dissipated. The fire flickered violently, and he realized it wasn't the wind. The warmth of the fire was being sucked away, like the cold was alive and pressing into the room. He considered leaving, getting back in the truck, and said, but the snow had buried the path. Even if he tried, he wouldn't make it through the drifts. The cabin was his only refuge, and yet it didn't feel safe. Around midnight, the scratching began. At first, light taps on the walls, then louder, more deliberate, like claws raking wood. Craig grabbed the rifle again, shaking as he aimed at the nearest window. Through the snowfall, he thought he saw a figure crouched low, its eyes glowing faintly red, watching him. It moved unnaturally, its limbs bending at odd angles. He fired, the shot cracking through the storm. The figure disappeared, and for a moment the world went silent. But the silence didn't last. Soon after, there was a pounding at the door, heavy and relentless. Craig tried to barricade it with a chair, but the pounding grew louder, more frantic, like the thing outside was testing its patience. Then came a new sound, a scraping, dragging noise across the roof. His stomach dropped. Whatever it was bigger than the cabin, stronger, and it was everywhere at once. He ran to the basement, locking the trapdoor behind him. The room was small, but it had a single small window near the ceiling, just big enough to peek through. Craig held the rifle, eyes wide, listening as the sounds above him moved. He could hear it climbing, circling, pacing. Every few minutes, a thud would shake the floor, and a shrill, inhuman screech would echo through the house. Hours passed like that. Craig couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The fire had gone out upstairs, leaving the house in a darkness so complete it felt suffocating. He huddled in the basement, counting every second, trying to convince himself that the sun would rise, that the storm would pass, that whatever was outside would leave. When morning finally came, the storm had weakened, leaving the landscape a blinding white. Craig climbed the stairs cautiously, expecting the worst. The cabin was a wreck, windows shattered, walls scratched, and deep grooves carved into the floorboards. But there was no sign of the creature, no footprints, nothing. Just the storm, burying the evidence beneath layers of snow. He stepped outside, the world eerily quiet. It was almost peaceful, except for the tracks leading from the woods to the cabin, deep, enormous, and unlike anything he had ever seen. They didn't look human, not animal, nothing he recognized. The prints led right up to the cabin, circled it, and then disappeared into the trees as if the creature had melted back into the forest. Craig never spoke of the incident to anyone, except his brother, who lived in the city. Even then, he downplayed it, calling it a big storm and an overactive imagination. But deep down, he knew what he had seen. Something was out there in the woods, something ancient, something patient, waiting for the perfect night, something that knew how to stalk, how to hunt, and how to terrorize without leaving a trace. Years later, the story came back to him in fragments. He read about disappearances in the same area, hikers never found, hunters gone without a trace. Some locals whispered about the winter shadow, a creature that came during the harshest storms, leaving tracks that melted away with the snow. They said it watched, waited, and that if you saw it, you were lucky to survive at all. Craig never returned to the cabin during winter. Every December, he felt a tightness in his chest, a sense of dread he couldn't explain. He would close every door, double-check every lock, and sometimes, when the wind howled just right, he swore he could hear it again. Soft, guttural whispers through the snow, calling his name, testing his patience, reminding him that the woods never forget. Karen, his wife, never went back either. The memory of that night lingered in her dreams. Shadowy figures moving outside the cabin, like red eyes glowing through the storm, the relentless scratching at the walls, and the voice calling her name from nowhere and everywhere at once. Even when far from the forest, she could feel the presence, waiting, circling, patient. The cabin still stands, but no one lives there in winter anymore. Neighbors avoid it, especially when the snow begins to fall. They tell stories of strange shapes in the woods, tracks that vanish, and the occasional scream carried on the wind. Craig and Karen's story became just another warning, whispered quietly. Do not go out in the winter storm. Do not stray into the woods. And if you ever hear your name whispered in the blizzard, do not answer. Because whatever is out there is patient. It waits. And when the snow falls thick and the wind is silent, it comes for anyone foolish enough to be alone. Story the end. The snow started early that December morning, falling in heavy fat flakes that blanketed the small town of Brattleboro, Vermont. By noon, the streets were nearly impassable, the storm showing no sign of slowing. Cars struggled to move, their tires spinning uselessly on ice-covered roads, and the wind carried the scent of pine and frozen earth through the air. For most, it was just another winter storm, the kind that shut schools down and kept people huddled by their fireplaces. But for the Miller family, it would be the coldest, darkest night they'd ever face. David Miller, a local construction worker, had been driving home from a long day at a site outside town. His truck creaked and groaned under the weight of the snow, the headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the white haze. He was used to winter storms, but this one felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the edges of the storm, a presence just beyond his vision. Shivering, he adjusted the heater and tried to focus on the road. The thought passed quickly, but the unease lingered. By the time he reached his home, his wife Karen and their teenage daughter Lily had been watching the snowfall for hours. They were snug inside, the warmth of the fireplace spreading slowly through the house. When David pulled up, the truck's tires skidded on the icy driveway, forcing him to use all his strength to guide it safely to the garage. The family greeted each other warmly, joking about the storm. But there was tension underneath the surface, a silent acknowledgement of the long, cold night ahead. Around 8 in the evening, the storm intensified. The wind whistled through the trees, and the snowdrifts against the windows were almost half the height of the walls. The power flickered several times before going out completely, leaving the house in total darkness, except for the fire. David went to check on the generator in the basement, muttering that it should have enough fuel for the night. Karen and Lily stayed in the living room, wrapped in blankets, trying to keep warm. That's when they first heard it, a faint tapping sound, almost like someone knocking on the windows. Karen paused, straining her ears over the crackling fire. It's probably just the branches, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Lily, sitting on the couch with a book, frowned. Mom, the branches aren't tapping like that. It's too regular. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, coming from the side of the house that faced the woods behind their property. David returned from the basement just as the sound intensified. He moved to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass, but the storm outside made visibility nearly impossible. It's just the snow hitting the windows, he insisted, though the look on his face betrayed his doubt. They tried to ignore it, convincing themselves that the storm was creating tricks of sound and shadow, but the tapping kept coming, steady and patient, like something waiting to be let in. Hours passed, and the wind seemed to carry more than just snow. Strange shapes appeared outside the windows, fleeting glimpses that disappeared when they looked directly. Lily swore she saw a figure in the woods, pale and thin, standing perfectly still, watching them. David tried to rationalize it, blaming exhaustion and the way the storm distorted shapes, but Karen noticed the way Lily's hands trembled as she held the blanket tighter around her. Near midnight, the tapping became louder, followed by scratching along the siding of the house as if claws were dragging across the wood. David grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the back door, which led to the woods. The snow outside was untouched, smooth and pure, except for faint footprints leading from the tree line to the edge of the deck. He froze. These prints were human-sized but irregular. The toes splayed at odd angles, leaving no clear pattern. There were no other tracks leading away. He called out, "Hello? Who's there?" His voice barely carried over the wind. There was no answer, only silence and the whisper of the storm. The family huddled together in the living room, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. Then came the voice, a low, almost human whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Let us in." It was so soft they could barely hear it over the wind, but the tone was unmistakable. David grabbed a bat from the corner, checking the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. Everything was secure, yet the feeling of being watched never left. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, not cast by the fire, but shifting as if they had a life of their own. Around 2 a.m., the temperature in the house dropped suddenly. Frost formed along the edges of the windows and doors, and their breath came out in white clouds. The fire sputtered and dimmed, leaving them in near total darkness. That's when the tapping returned, this time from the front door. The doorknob rattled, slowly, deliberately, like someone or something was trying to open it. David swung the bat, ready to strike whatever appeared, but there was nothing outside when he checked. Yet the sound of scratching continued, now moving across the roof, circling the house. Lily, trembling, whispered that she could see faces in the snow outside the windows, dozens of pale faces pressed up against the glass. David and Karen strained to see through the storm, but the snow and darkness made it impossible. Still, they could feel the presence, a weight pressing in, cold and unyielding. The house groaned under the wind, but some of the sounds were too deliberate, too precise to be the storm. Something was moving on its own, just beyond the light, just beyond reach. By 3 a.m., the family could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. They barricaded themselves in the living room, pulling the sofa against the doors and stacking chairs to reinforce the windows. The whispering voices grew louder, chanting unintelligible words, overlapping in a way that made their teeth ache. Then came the laughter, soft, high-pitched, echoing, as if dozens of children were playing outside, except the sound was wrong, too hollow, too cruel. Hours passed like this. The storm outside raged on, relentless, while inside the house the temperature continued to drop. The fire, once bright and comforting, was now little more than embers, failing to hold back the cold that seeped into every corner. At one point, David thought he saw shadows moving under the furniture, crawling along the floor. When he shone the flashlight, nothing was there, but the feeling remained, as if whatever it was could hide and yet always be present. By dawn, the storm finally began to ease. Snow fell more gently, and the wind's howl diminished to a whisper. Exhausted and terrified, the family cautiously ventured outside, expecting some rational explanation, a prank, animals, or debris from the storm. What they found instead made their blood run cold. The snow surrounding the house was not smooth as it had been when the storm started. Instead, it was churned into a chaotic pattern of footprints, some human-like, some impossible, leading in circles around the house. And in the center of the yard, directly under the largest window of the living room, was a handprint frozen in the snow, pale and detailed as though someone or something had pressed it there and left without another trace. The police were called, but they found nothing unusual beyond the storm's damage. No footprints led to the woods. No one reported strange figures in the area, and the Miller house appeared ordinary from the outside. Still, the family could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, even after the storm passed. Shadows seemed longer, colder, and the wind carried whispers that were just at the edge of hearing. David, Karen, and Lily never fully recovered. They moved to another state the following year, trying to leave the memory behind. But every winter, when the snow falls thick and the wind whistles through the trees, they hear the tapping. And sometimes, just sometimes, they catch the flash of pale faces in the shadows, watching, waiting for the next storm to bring them home. Story the end. The storm hit Black Hollow just after dusk, turning the quiet town into a frozen maze of white. Snow fell so thick it swallowed everything in sight, covering the streets, the cars, even the mailboxes, with a blanket so heavy that branches sagged under the weight. People had retreated indoors hours ago, drawing curtains against the blizzard and piling wood in fireplaces. Streetlights cast dim circles that barely penetrated the snow, and the wind tore through the town with a howl that made even the hardiest residents pull coats tighter around their bodies. Daniel Carter, a lifelong resident, had never felt the storm like this before. He lived on the edge of town in an old farmhouse passed down from his grandparents, surrounded by woods so dense that in winter they seemed to swallow every sound. Daniel liked the solitude most of the time, but tonight, as he shoveled the last few feet of snow from the driveway, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. Something was off. He couldn't put his finger on it, just a sense that the night was watching him. He went inside, dripping wet from the snow, and lit the fireplace. The flames cast long shadows across the old wooden floorboards, stretching and twisting like they had a life of their own. His wife, Claire, had already gone to bed, tucked under layers of blankets with the window cracked just enough to let in the scent of the storm. Daniel poured himself a glass of bourbon and leaned against the counter, staring out the window into the pitch-black woods beyond the yard. That's when he first heard it, a soft tapping at the back door. He froze. The storm was loud, relentless, but this tapping, deliberate, slow, measured. He shook his head, muttering that it was probably just a branch hitting the siding. But the sound came again, clearer this time, almost like fingernails drumming. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking slightly. No answer. Daniel's hand moved toward the kitchen knife he kept on the counter, more out of habit than fear. He opened the back door, the snow blowing into the kitchen in a cold rush. There was nothing, just the white, endless snow, swirling and thick. He squinted, trying to see through the storm, but the wind tore at his vision. Then he noticed footprints, small, human-shaped, leading up to the door and stopping abruptly at the threshold. He stepped back, heart hammering. Nobody was outside in this storm. It was impossible. Closing the door quickly, he bolted it and checked the locks. Claire stirred in bed. "Daniel, what's going on?" "Just nothing. Go back to sleep," he said, forcing calm. But even as he spoke, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was inside him, crawling along his spine. Hours passed in tense silence. The wind howled, the snow piled higher, then came the knocking. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks on the front door, followed by a pause, and then 3 more. Daniel froze. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't anything normal. He grabbed his flashlight and flung open the door, but the snow was a white wall. Empty. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard, but saw nothing. And then he noticed movement in the woods, something small and hunched, moving between the trees faster than any human could. "Who's there?" he shouted, voice shaking. No answer, only the wind, and then a whisper, soft and low, almost lost in the storm. "Daniel." He spun around. Claire's window was dark, no sign she was awake. The whisper came again, carried by the wind, almost inside his head. "Daniel." Panic rising, he slammed the door and locked it. He called out her name, but the storm swallowed it. He tried the phone. Dead. Not surprising in the middle of a blizzard, but now he felt truly trapped. And then the scratching started. Not at the door this time. Inside the house, something clawing at the walls, slow and deliberate. He grabbed the hatchet from the hall, heart pounding. The scratching moved from the kitchen to the living room, then upstairs, circling, always moving, never still. Daniel wanted to convince himself it was the wind, or maybe a tree branch that had somehow gotten inside, but he knew. He knew this wasn't natural. He forced himself upstairs, hatchet raised. The bedroom was empty. Claire was there, asleep, or pretending to be. The window was cracked, frost creeping inward along the frame, and then he saw it. Footprints across the carpet, small, wet, leading from the window to the center of the room where they stopped. He backed up, heart hammering, flashlight trembling, and then a giggle. High, eerie, and childlike. "Daniel." The whispering came again, back, louder now, insistent. It was coming from the closet. Every instinct told him to leave, to run into the storm, but he couldn't. Something rooted him to the spot, a cold dread so deep it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. He flung open the closet door. Empty. Nothing. Just coats and boxes, the shadows stretched long by the flashlight, and yet the giggling continued. Behind him? He spun. The room was empty. But the footprints, they hadn't stopped in the closet. They twisted unnaturally, as if moving on their own, disappearing into the walls, into the air. Daniel ran downstairs, heart racing. He needed to get out, needed to escape the house, the whispering, the feeling of eyes on him. He grabbed his coat and boots, threw them on, and stepped into the storm. The snow was waist-deep, wind tearing at his face. And there it was again, the movement in the woods, faster now, darting between trees, circling him. "Daniel." The whisper followed him. Always there, sometimes behind him, sometimes ahead. He stumbled, fell, snow filling his gloves, his hair, his mouth, and then he saw them. Smaller figures, dozens of them, moving between the trees. Faces pale, eyes black, mouths stretched in unnatural grins. They laughed, whispered, called his name, darting closer with every step. He tried to run, but the snow slowed him, pulled at his feet until he collapsed. The figures circled him, their whispers rising into a chorus, and then the tallest of them stepped forward. Thin, unnaturally tall, limbs bending wrong, skin stretched tight, its eyes black pits met his. Daniel screamed, a sound swallowed immediately by the wind and snow, and then he was gone. Claire awoke hours later, alone. The storm had passed. The snow lay deep and perfect, covering every trace of the night's terror. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing but white. She called the police. They searched the woods, the yard, the house. Nothing. Probably disoriented in the storm, they said. We'll turn up soon. But Daniel never did. Neighbors whispered about Black Hollow, about the forest that seemed alive in winter, about children and adults who vanished without a trace during blizzards. They said the trees move, the snow hides things, the wind carries voices that shouldn't exist. People leave at night and never return. And sometimes, years later, someone hears a whisper on a December night, carried on the wind, calling a name that shouldn't be called. Every winter, Claire lights candles in the windows and keeps the doors locked. She never opens them, never answers the whisper. But sometimes, in the dead hours of a storm, she swears she hears scratching at the walls, faint and deliberate, followed by a whisper. Daniel. Story the end. The wind howled like a living thing that night, rattling the windows of the old cabin in northern Vermont. Snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets, blanketing the forest in an unbroken white. Inside, the small wood stove hissed and popped, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Emily and her brother, Daniel, had driven up from Boston earlier that afternoon, seeking the quiet of the woods, a break from the city's constant noise. They thought a weekend getaway would be peaceful, just a few days of hiking, reading, and forgetting about the world. They were wrong. By late evening, the storm had gained full strength. The wind screamed across the trees, bending them under its force, and snow was piling up against the cabin door in tall drifts. Emily sat near the fire, her knees drawn to her chest, watching the flames dance, while Daniel busied himself chopping more wood for the stove. Despite the cozy warmth inside, both of them felt a creeping unease, like the woods themselves were watching. It began subtly. At first, it was just a noise, a soft crunching at the edge of the clearing outside the cabin. Daniel looked up from his chopping. Probably a deer, he said, trying to sound casual. Emily didn't respond. She could feel it too, a disturbance in the rhythm of the storm. The crunching stopped as quickly as it had started. Then came another sound, a low, almost imperceptible scratching against the door. Daniel got up, leaning over the window to look out into the blizzard. He saw nothing. It's just the wind, he said. Emily wasn't convinced. The wind didn't move with intention, didn't pause and scrape like something was circling the cabin. Hours passed. They tried to distract themselves with cards, with reading, with the little tasks that came with staying in an old cabin. But every so often, the sounds would return, the scratching, the crunching, the faint taps against the walls. Emily swore she saw movement outside the window, shapes shifting in the snow. But when she blinked, there was nothing. Around midnight, the storm's fury reached its peak. The wind banged against the windows and shook the walls. The fire sputtered and the lights flickered. Then came the sound that made Emily freeze. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, heavy. She nudged Daniel. "Did you hear that?" He paused, listening. The wind whistled past the cabin, but the footsteps were distinct. Clear. Measured. And they weren't moving. They were pacing just outside the front door. Daniel tried the rational approach. Probably just an animal. A raccoon, maybe. Or he stopped, the unease creeping into his voice. Emily clutched his arm. The door rattled under a push from outside. Not strong enough to break it, but strong enough to make the cabin feel like a trap. The temperature dropped suddenly, frost forming along the edges of the windows. They could see their breath, and then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. Minutes passed. Then a soft whispering came from the hall outside their bedroom. Emily couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably human, soft, taunting, close enough to brush her ear. Daniel grabbed the baseball bat they'd brought for firewood splitting, his hands trembling. The whispering stopped. Emily wanted to call 911, but the storm had knocked out their cell service. The nearest neighbor was miles away, probably unreachable. Isolation wrapped around them like a shroud. The whispers returned, this time joined by a dragging sound, something heavy being pulled across the wooden floor just beyond the hallway. They both froze, listening as the cabin seemed to breathe around them. Emily's courage broke first. She wanted to run, to escape into the snowstorm, even knowing the risk of freezing to death. But Daniel held her back. "We stay together," he said. "We wait for the storm to end." Hours crawled by. They huddled together in the bedroom, flashlight and bat in hand. Each noise outside the walls made them jump. A knock, a scratch, the soft tap of something moving across the porch. Shadows moved in the corners of their eyes, shapes that didn't belong to the furniture or the flickering candlelight. Then, near dawn, Emily saw it. A figure standing outside the window, tall and impossibly thin. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light. Its mouth was open, but there was no sound. It raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. The frost seemed to swirl unnaturally around it, forming icy patterns that reached toward the cabin like fingers. Emily screamed, but Daniel was already there, rushing to block the window. The figure was gone the instant he turned to look. By morning, the storm had passed. The snow outside was untouched, pristine, no footprints of any kind. The cabin was silent, but the air carried the memory of the previous night, a cold that seemed unnatural, a weight in the chest that wouldn't lift. Emily and Daniel didn't wait. They packed in silence and drove away, neither daring to speak about what they had seen. Back in Boston, the city felt impossibly warm and bright, but the fear clung to them. Emily noticed it first. Every December, she would wake to the sound of faint footsteps in her apartment, just at the edge of hearing. Daniel started seeing shadows moving across the corner of his vision, shapes that vanished when he looked directly. The memory of that cabin, of the figure, of the whispers in the snowstorm, stayed with them, persistent and unrelenting. Years later, Emily returned to northern Vermont, not to the cabin, but to the surrounding woods. Locals told her stories of winter watchers, spirits or entities that roamed the forest during the deepest storms, appearing at the edges of homes, pacing porches, tapping walls. Some said they were drawn to loneliness, to isolation, to fear itself. Others believed they were warnings or portents or curses. Emily didn't know what to believe. All she knew was that whatever had been at the cabin had chosen to watch, and once it had chosen, it never forgot. Daniel never returned to Vermont. He moved to Colorado, seeking distance from the memories, from the snow, from the cold, but the nightmares followed him. Sometimes, in the middle of a storm, he swore he could hear whispering at his door, scratching along the walls, the soft crunch of footsteps circling the house. He never opens the door, never looks out the window. Emily tried to convince herself that the winters in Vermont had been a fluke, a one-time encounter with something unexplainable. But deep down, she knew better. She had seen the figure pressed against the window. She had felt the unnatural cold seep into the cabin, had heard the dragging, the whispering. She understood now what the locals meant when they said, "The winter watchers never forgot." One December, on a night much like the one at the cabin, Emily received a call from Daniel. His voice was shaking, and in the background, the wind screamed against his cabin in the Colorado mountains. He told her he had seen something outside his window, something pale, tall, silent, watching. The snow had been falling thickly, just as it had in Vermont. The footsteps were soft, deliberate, circling the house. The whispers returned, faint at first, then rising in volume. Emily knew then that the winter watchers weren't tied to a single place. They followed, patient and silent, waiting for fear to grow, feeding on the isolation that snowstorms bring. They were winter itself, an embodiment of the cold, creeping through the forests and fields, circling homes and staring through windows at anyone who dared to be alone. Neither Emily nor Daniel slept that night. They sat on opposite ends of their respective cabins, listening to the wind, listening to the whispers, knowing that the watchers were there somewhere, just beyond the walls. And though they were far apart, they both felt the same unshakable certainty that some part of them would never be free from that night in the snow, from the eyes at the window, from the dragging sounds in the hall, from the cold that wasn't just winter, but something alive, something patient, something that would never stop waiting. Story the end. The December wind cut through the town of Millbrook like a knife, rattling windows and twisting around the corners of deserted streets. Snow had fallen relentlessly for 3 days straight, piling high against the sides of houses and turning the roads into icy rivers that no plow could keep clear. Most people had barricaded themselves inside, fireplaces roaring and mugs of steaming coffee in hand. But not everyone stayed indoors. James Thornton had lived in Millbrook his whole life, and he knew the winters could be brutal. But there was something different this year. The cold felt heavier, almost sentient, like it was pressing against him as he trudged through the thick snow on his way home from his late shift at the hardware store. The town was eerily silent, the usual hum of cars and neighbors muffled beneath the thick blanket of snow. Even the dogs seemed to have disappeared. He had parked near the edge of town by the old Miller farm, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. The wooden farmhouse had leaned to one side for years, windows boarded, roof sagging, the fence broken in places. Everyone avoided it, especially in the winter, when the snow and ice made every creak and groan of the old wood sound alive. James had walked past it countless times, but tonight something about it made him glance over his shoulder. There was a figure in the upstairs window, just a silhouette, pale against the darkness. He shook his head, telling himself it was a trick of the shadows. But the feeling of being watched stayed with him, gnawing at his nerves as he walked faster. When he reached his house, the warm glow of the porch light should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a lifeline in a storm of unease. The door was locked, the house silent except for the hum of the heater. James kicked off his wet boots, hung his coat, and tried to shake off the strange feeling that had followed him all the way home. He sat down with a cup of coffee, trying to focus on the mundane: bills, groceries, the upcoming holiday. But the silent side pressed against the windows. The wind made the trees scratch and groan, and occasionally he thought he heard footsteps crunching in the snow around the house. Every time he looked, there was nothing, just the drifting snow and shadows moving strangely in the dim light. Around midnight, a loud thump came from the attic. James froze. He didn't usually go up there, not since he had cleared out old boxes last spring, but tonight the sound was deliberate, insistent, like something heavy had fallen. He grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight. The attic door was slightly ajar, though he was certain he had locked it earlier. He pushed it open, shining the light around the empty space. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls. Old furniture covered in sheets leaned against each other. Nothing was out of place until he noticed the footprints in the thin layer of dust. Small, wet footprints leading from one end of the attic to the other, then disappearing under the far wall. James held his breath, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. There had been no footprints when he had cleaned this place in the summer. Now something had moved here, unseen, while he sat downstairs. A cold draft swept through the attic. The door slammed shut behind him. James spun around, flashlight trembling in his hands. The beam landed on a figure crouched in the corner. A man, or at least something resembling one, pale and hunched, with eyes that reflected the light unnaturally. The thing didn't move at first, just watched him. Then it whispered, a voice so low and hoarse it sounded like the wind itself. "I've been waiting." James stumbled backward, tripping over a box and falling hard onto the dusty floor. The flashlight skittered across the room, casting frantic shadows. The figure moved closer, slow and deliberate, limbs bending at impossible angles. James scrambled to his feet and bolted for the attic door, yanking it open and throwing himself down the stairs. He didn't stop until he slammed the front door behind him, panting, heart hammering. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the air was heavy and still, suffocating. James didn't even think about calling the police. He ran to his neighbor's house, banging on the door until someone woke up. The sheriff came shortly after, flashlight in hand, but when they returned to James's house, the attic was empty. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. The boxes and furniture were exactly where they had been, dust undisturbed. The sheriff gave him a look like he was crazy, muttering something about stress and winter fatigue. James didn't argue. He knew what he had seen, what he had felt, the cold that seemed to move with the figure, the unnatural eyes, the whisper that lingered in his ears. That night, James didn't sleep. He stayed in the living room, flashlight in hand, watching the shadows in the corners of the room. Occasionally, he thought he saw movement, a flicker at the edge of his vision. Max, his dog, refused to come inside, growling and barking at empty spaces. Over the next few days, James tried to convince himself it had been a hallucination, triggered by exhaustion and cold. But then the noises started again. Footsteps in the snow outside when no one was there, scratches on the walls, faint whispers when the wind blew through the trees. His house felt alive in a way that was wrong, as if something had claimed it while he slept. One evening, a week later, the snow started falling again. James had barricaded the doors, checked the windows, and double-checked the locks. He sat with Max by the fireplace, hoping the warmth would chase away the memories. But as the night deepened, a shadow moved across the living room wall. It was long and thin, stretching unnaturally, moving in a way no human could. James froze. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You can't hide." He bolted to the front door, only to find it frozen shut, covered in thick ice that hadn't been there before. The windows rattled, and the shadows stretched along the walls, creeping closer. Max barked furiously, but even the dog was shaking. James grabbed a fire poker and braced himself, heart pounding. The shadow paused at the edge of the light, then recoiled as if savoring the fear it had induced. The next morning, the snow had stopped, and everything seemed normal again. But James knew it wasn't. The house felt different, heavier somehow. Max refused to go into the attic, and James avoided it too, never setting foot there again. Every December, when the wind howled and the snow piled high, the memories returned. The shadow, the whisper, the cold presence that waited for him. Neighbors noticed the change in him. He stopped going out at night, avoided social gatherings, and rarely left his home. Millbrook whispered about him, claiming he was cursed, that the Thornton house was haunted. James didn't care about rumors. He only knew the truth. Whatever had entered his home that December was still there, waiting, patient, and eternal. Years passed, but the winter horrors never stopped. Each December, the cold seemed sharper, the nights longer. James would hear scratching at the doors, feel the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing against him. Sometimes he would wake to find his windows fogged from the inside, strange messages written in condensation. "I'm still here." No one believed him, and he stopped trying to make them. Millbrook remained a quiet town in the snow, innocent by day, sinister by night, and James Thornton, trapped in his own home, lived in perpetual winter, haunted by something that defied explanation, something that had chosen him and would never let go. He knew he would never escape it. The cold was no longer just weather, it was alive, and it had found him. Each winter, as the snow piled higher and the wind screamed through the trees, James could feel it moving closer, listening, waiting. And deep down, he understood the inevitable. Winter would come, and with it, the darkness that had made its home in his life would return once more. Story the end. The cold had settled over northern Montana, the way a heavy quilt might settle over a bed, dense, suffocating, and without mercy. December there didn't creep in. It crashed, bringing winds that scraped across the plains and nights so still they felt hollow. On that particular night, the one I still can't talk about without my voice tightening, the temperature had dropped to 21 below, and the sky had that soft, bruised look that warned of another storm rolling in. I was driving back from Havre along Highway 2, a lonely stretch even on good days, because my mother insisted on having her Christmas decorations up early, and I had promised I'd stop by to set up her porch lights. She lived alone out in a little house built long before insulation was something people took seriously. I'd meant to get there before dark. That's what I told myself later, even though it wouldn't have made a difference. The heater in my old Silverado was working so hard it gave off that faint burning dust smell, but the cold still crept in around the edges. The radio crackled with static, storm interference, but every so often it picked up a station playing scratchy Christmas music. It made the trip strangely eerie, hearing cheerful jingles cut in and out of a sea of white noise on a highway where I hadn't passed another car in almost 30 miles. Then the lights along the dash flickered once, twice, and the engine sputtered. I let out a sharp breath, thumping the side of the steering wheel as if that would somehow coax the truck into behaving. It didn't. It coughed hard, jolted dryly, and then died altogether, rolling to a dead stop beside the drift-covered shoulder. I turned the key. Nothing, not even a whine. Just the emptiness of the plains swallowing the sound of my breath. I checked my phone, no signal, not unusual, but that didn't make it any less unnerving. I killed the headlights to save the battery, and for a moment the world went completely black. Then my eyes adjusted, and the faint glow of the moon lit the frozen fields that spread out endlessly on either side of the road. The silence was thick, the kind that presses against your eardrums. I tried telling myself it wasn't that far to my mother's place. 7 miles, maybe 8. I could walk it. People had done worse in worse weather. But walking on a highway in a blizzard's shadow wasn't smart, and the wind was starting to push harder, sweeping grit-like snow across the road in thin ghost trails. I decided I'd give the truck 10 minutes to miraculously revive. When it didn't, I bundled up tighter, grabbed the little flashlight from the glove box, and stepped out. The cold hit like a slap, sharp enough to steal my breath. The wind clawed at my jacket as if trying to rip it open. I tucked my chin down and started walking east, boots crunching against the hard-packed snow. The silence followed me, broken only by the steady rhythm of my steps and the occasional groan of distant shifting ice. After maybe half an hour, the kind of time where the cold makes seconds stretch long and cruel, I saw something up ahead, a faint, trembling orange glow. At first, I thought it might be headlights from a distant car. Then I realized the light wasn't moving. It flickered like fire. A fire, I told myself, someone camping or maybe a broken-down vehicle with a flare. Either way, warmth. Maybe help. I picked up my pace, legs burning with cold, breath forming thick clouds. As I drew closer, I saw it was a cabin, small, old, sitting back from the road, maybe 20 yards. The fire wasn't a fire at all, but lamplight spilling from the single window. I didn't remember a cabin ever being out here. My family had lived in this part of Montana most of our lives. You knew the houses, the ranches, even the old abandoned barns, but I'd never seen this one. It looked sagging, bowed with age, but not broken. Smoke curled from the chimney in thin wisps, and the warm glow pulsed against the swirling snow like an invitation. Or a warning. Hard to say which. Still, cold overrides caution. I climbed over the shallow ditch and trudged toward it. As I got closer, I could see the wood siding faded to a washed-out gray, the door slightly crooked on its hinges. The snow around the place was oddly undisturbed. No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of anyone coming or going. But the lamplight continued to flicker. I hesitated at the door, raised a gloved fist, and knocked. For a second, nothing happened. Then something shuffled inside. Not footsteps exactly, more like fabric brushing against wood. A moment later, the door creaked open a few inches. Warm, almost too warm, air spilled out. The glow inside was yellow and soft, like candlelight. An old woman peered through the crack. Her face was lined, deeply, almost unnaturally. She wore a heavy wool shawl over her shoulders, and her hair was long and silver gray, hanging in wiry waves around her face. "You're freezing," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Come in before the night takes you." I didn't need convincing. I stepped inside, and she closed the door quickly behind me, shutting out the wind. The interior was small but warm, warmer than seemed possible for such a drafty old place. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner, orange light leaking from its seams. A lantern sat on a table, flame swaying gently. The place smelled faintly of pine and something else, something sweet, like herbs hung to dry. "Thank you," I said, rubbing my hands together. "My truck died out on the highway. Didn't think anyone lived out this way." "Not many do," she replied, moving toward the stove. Her steps were slow but smooth, almost gliding. She motioned for me to sit in the wooden chair near the heat. I sank into it, gratefully, feeling the warmth seep into my frozen limbs. She poured something from a kettle into a mug and handed it to me. Steam curled up, carrying the scent of mint and something floral. I hesitated. I don't take drinks from strangers in the middle of nowhere as a rule, but the cold had dug into my bones and the heat felt like salvation. I took a sip. It was sweet, soothing, like honey and herbs. Instantly, my chest loosened, my fingers tingled with returning warmth. "You were lucky," she said, settling across from me. "Most nights this cold don't give second chances." I nodded, staring into the stove's glow. "Is there a phone I could use?" "There hasn't been a phone here in a long time," she said with a small smile. "Storms took the line years ago. You can rest here until the wind settles, then you'll be on your way. I thanked her again, though a small discomfort crept under my skin. Something about her voice, her stillness, her eyes, dark and deep-set, felt off. Not threatening, exactly. Just strange, but I was alive and warm, and that counted for something. After a few minutes, I noticed there were no personal belongings in the place. No photos, no knickknacks, no books. Just the table, the stove, and the lantern. The walls were bare. The air felt almost too still. "Do you live here alone?" I asked. She nodded. "Always have. Always will." I couldn't tell if she meant that figuratively or literally. Before I could ask more, something brushed the back of my neck, a thin, cold draft. But there were no gaps in the walls, no cracks in the windows. The stove heat hadn't changed. I rubbed my neck and glanced behind me. Nothing. Then she spoke again, very softly. "You shouldn't have been out there tonight, not on a night like this." Her tone had shifted. Not warning, knowing. I swallowed. "Yeah, well, I didn't really plan on it." She tilted her head. "No one plans to meet what wanders these roads in December." I tried to laugh lightly. "Wolves?" Her eyes locked on mine. "Not wolves." The lantern flickered sharply, as if jarred by a sudden movement, though nothing had touched it. Shadows shifted along the walls, long and thin, stretching out in strange angles. My skin prickled. "What's out there?" I asked, because something in her tone said she wasn't speaking metaphorically. She looked toward the door, her expression tightening. "Things that don't bother with names, things that follow the lost, things that freeze the breath in your lungs before you ever feel afraid." I told myself she was old, maybe lonely, maybe not well, but the hair on my arms rose. I stood slowly. "I appreciate everything, but I think I should." A loud thud hit the outside wall. I froze. The woman didn't move. Another thud. Heavy, slow, something dragging. My pulse hammered. "Is that—" "Don't open the door," she whispered. The dragging sound circled the cabin, steady, purposeful, something big, something that moved with deliberate weight. Snow shifted outside, not like wind, but like something pushing through it. The woman stood, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulder. "Sit." I didn't. The dragging stopped right outside the door. Silence pressed in. Then a slow, deep scrape ran across the wood, right at chest height. Not claws. Not branches. Fingers. Long ones. The woman closed her eyes. "It smelled your fear on the road. You drew it here." My mouth went dry. "What the hell is it?" She opened her eyes again, and for the first time, I saw not fear, but pity. "It doesn't matter what it is, only that you don't let it in." Something pressed against the door so hard the hinges groaned. The wood bowed inward. Snow sifted down from the ceiling. I staggered back, gripping the edge of the table. Then the creature, or whatever it was, made a sound. A muffled, distorted moan, like a voice trying to speak after being buried alive. My bones felt like they vibrated with it. The woman stepped in front of the door, placing one thin hand against the wood. The pressure from outside eased slightly, though the door still trembled. "You need to leave," she said without turning around. "In case you haven't noticed, there's nowhere to go." "There is," she whispered. "Back into the cold." She turned then, and for the first time, fear rippled across her face. Not of the creature, of me staying. "This place helps the lost, but it cannot fight for you. If you remain, it will come through, and when it does, you will wish you had frozen out on the road." The lantern flickered wildly. The room dimmed. Cold crept across the floorboards like a living thing. I didn't understand why leaving was safer. It sounded insane. But there was something in her voice, an urgency that felt ancient, practiced, like she had said these words before. The door cracked. A thin line split through the wood. Snow gusted in. I grabbed my coat, heart slamming, and stumbled toward the back of the cabin. "There's no back exit," I said. "There is tonight," she replied, and she pointed. Where bare wall had been minutes earlier, a door now stood, not tall enough for comfort, narrow, old, hinges rusted. I didn't question it. The front door shuddered violently, wood splintering. I rushed to the newly formed door and yanked it open. Beyond it was the night, the wind, the empty plains. I looked back. She gave me a small, sad smile. "Don't look behind you. Whatever you hear, don't look." The creature slammed into the cabin's front door. It cracked inward another inch. I bolted into the cold. The door behind me slammed shut on its own. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The wind roared around me, snow biting at my cheeks. Every few seconds I heard something behind me. Heavy steps, slow but closing in. a dragging noise cutting through the stillness. The wind carried a voice too, faint, stretched thin. Stop! I didn't. I ran until my legs burned, until the cold clawed up my spine and my throat felt raw from breathing frozen air. Somewhere, minutes or hours later, I saw headlights. A plow truck. Its brakes screeched as the driver spotted me staggering in the snow. They pulled me inside, wrapped me in blankets, asked me what happened. I couldn't explain it, not in any way that made sense. When they drove me back down the highway, I pointed toward where the cabin had been. There was nothing there. No cabin, no chimney, no footprints, no disturbed snow at all, just flat, untouched white. But my tracks were clear, leading from nowhere to the road. For weeks after, I didn't sleep well. Winter nights pressed hard against the windows, and sometimes when the wind shifted right, I swore I heard dragging outside. That cabin saved my life. Or the woman did. Or maybe both. But whatever followed me in the snow that night, whatever prowls those miles of empty plains in December, didn't lose interest easily. And every year, when the cold settles deep and the sky turns that bruised purple color, I avoid Highway 2 after dark. I keep off that road entirely if I can help it, because some things out in the winter don't care whether you live in them. They only care that you're alone. Story the end. The wind had been relentless all day, rattling the windows of the small cabin that sat isolated on the edge of the northern Minnesota woods. Snow fell in thick, unbroken sheets, turning the familiar landscape into an alien world of white. Inside, the air smelled faintly of burning pine, but it wasn't enough to cut through the sense of unease that had settled over the house. Mike Larson, a man in his late 30s, had come here to escape the city, seeking the peace only the remote wilderness could offer. What he found instead was a winter night that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It had started innocuously enough. He arrived that morning, the sun barely rising over the horizon, and spent the day hauling firewood and unpacking supplies. The snowstorm hadn't yet begun, but the sky was heavy with clouds, threatening. By evening, he had lit the fireplace, brewed a pot of coffee, and settled into a worn armchair by the hearth, a blanket drawn over his legs. The storm arrived with the sunset, and soon the world outside was a blur of white and wind. It was beautiful, in a terrible, isolating way. Around 8 o'clock, he heard the first faint sound that didn't belong to the storm. At first, he thought it was the wind, or perhaps a branch scraping against the side of the cabin. But then it came again, soft footsteps crunching over the snow outside. He froze, listening. There was no road leading to the cabin, and no one had come with him. The sound was deliberate, slow, approaching the front door. Mike's first instinct was to ignore it. Probably an animal, he muttered to himself. But the steps didn't match any animal he knew. They were too heavy, too measured. He checked the windows, peering into the blizzard, but visibility was nearly zero. Whatever was out there was only a few feet away, he realized, and yet he could see nothing. Minutes stretched. Then the sound stopped. Mike tried to convince himself he was imagining things. He had lived alone before, and sometimes isolation played tricks on your mind. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that someone or something was waiting for him outside in the cold. He went to the door, hand trembling on the handle. The snow was piled high, the porch slick with ice. When he opened it, there was no one, just the endless whiteness, the wind howling around the cabin. No footprints, nothing. It was as if the footsteps had come and gone without leaving a trace. The unease tightened around his chest, but he told himself to calm down. "You're overthinking it," he said. "It's just snow, just the wind." He went back inside, locked the door, and tried to focus on a movie, anything to distract himself. But the storm outside was relentless, and the sense of being watched only grew. Around midnight, the power flickered, then went out entirely. The cabin was plunged into darkness except for the flickering fire. He lit a candle and set it on the table, its weak flame throwing shadows on the walls. Then he heard it again. This time, it was coming from inside the cabin. A low, dragging sound from the hallway outside the living room. His heart slammed in his chest. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking. No answer. The sound stopped. Mike grabbed a flashlight, pointing it toward the hall. The beam caught nothing but empty walls and a coat rack. A sudden cold draft made him shiver. He realized the temperature in the room had dropped sharply, as if winter itself had poured in. His breath formed a mist in the dim candlelight. The dragging sound started again, closer now and accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably a voice. Soft, sibilant, chilling. Mike backed into the living room, eyes darting around, trying to find an escape route. He thought about calling 911, but the storm had knocked out cell service. The nearest neighbor was miles away. He was completely isolated. The dragging and whispering continued, circling the cabin, sometimes from the front, sometimes from the back. It was patient, methodical, like it knew he had nowhere to run. He grabbed a hunting knife from the kitchen drawer. His rational mind told him it was ridiculous, that nothing human could have gotten inside without leaving signs. But every rational thought was drowned by primal fear. He moved toward the bedroom, intending to barricade himself inside. As he passed the hallway, the whispering stopped. Silence. To complete. Then came a knock. One deliberate, slow knock, like someone was tapping on the walls themselves. Mike froze. The sound was coming from all directions now. He could feel it vibrating through the floor, like through the furniture. Then the whisper returned, this time right behind him, cold breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, swinging the knife, and the hallway was empty. Just shadows. Just him. Just the fire flickering weakly. The night dragged on. Every few minutes a new sound would erupt, a scrape, a knock, a whisper, always just beyond reach, always impossible to locate. Exhaustion overtook him. By the early hours of the morning, he was shaking, huddled in the corner of the living room, too terrified to sleep, but too worn out to stay fully alert. Then, just before dawn, he saw it. A figure, tall and pale, standing at the window, looking in. Its face was obscured by frost, but the eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly with an unnatural light. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. The cold seemed to seep through the window, into the room, into Mike's very bones. He screamed and ran to the door, throwing it open. The figure was gone. Outside, the snow was untouched, no footprints, no trace that anything had been there at all. By sunrise, the storm had passed. The world outside was pristine and silent. Mike didn't wait. He packed what he could and drove the winding road back to civilization, vowing never to return. But the memory followed him, relentless. That whisper in the dark, the dragging sound in the hall, the pale figure at the window. Each detail burned into his mind. Months later, Mike discovered he wasn't the first to experience something like this. Old locals spoke of winter visitors, shadows that appeared during blizzards, lingering near the edges of homes in remote areas. They said the cold drew them, that they moved silently, watching, waiting, and that those who saw them were forever changed. The stories were dismissed as folklore by Valerie Pierce, but Mike knew what he had seen was real. The memory of that night returned every December, stronger with each snowfall. One year, on another cold December night, he found himself driving back toward the cabin, against his better judgment, against every instinct. He told himself he had to confront the fear, to prove it was just imagination. As he approached the familiar winding road, the storm rolled in again, faster than he expected. The trees groaned under the weight of snow, and then just ahead he saw the cabin. Its windows glowed faintly in the blizzard. Relief washed over him, followed by a creeping dread. Something was off. The front door was open, not slightly ajar, but wide open, swinging slowly in the wind. Mike's stomach churned. He stopped the car, gripping the wheel. The snow outside the cabin was perfectly undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints leading from the door into the forest. They were huge, far too large for a human, and each step seemed to press unnaturally deep into the snow. Mike didn't follow them. He didn't even try to enter. He turned the car around and drove away, the feeling of being watched settling over him like a second skin. Over the years, he moved far away from Minnesota, but every winter, whenever the snow begins to fall, he feels the same dread. Sometimes he wakes in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in his own home, the whispering just at the edge of hearing. And he knows with absolute certainty that those winter visitors never forget. They wait, patient, silent, always watching. Story the end. The wind had been picking up all afternoon, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse on the outskirts of Marrow Creek. By sundown, the snow had already started piling up in thick drifts, blanketing the fields and the skeletal trees that lined the dirt road. The Morton family, tucked inside the small living room, felt the familiar unease that always came with a December storm. It wasn't just the cold, it was something older, something that seemed to linger in the way shadows gathered in corners or the way the fire's glow danced across the wooden walls. It started with the phone. The landline, a clunky relic that hadn't rung in months, screamed to life just as dusk settled. Lily Morton, 17 and stubborn in ways that frustrated her parents, snatched it up. "Hello?" A long silence hung before a voice whispered, raspy and uneven. "Don't go outside." She froze. "Who is this?" No answer, just the faint sound of wind, muffled and uneven, as though it were breathing through someone's teeth. She hung up, heart pounding, telling herself it was probably a wrong number or some kid screwing around. But the unease didn't fade. Her father, Harold Morton, a tall man whose broad shoulders always seemed to carry the weight of the world, checked the locks on the doors. "Probably just some prank," he muttered, though the line in his jaw betrayed him. The snowstorm outside had made the roads impassable, cutting them off from town, from help. By 9 o'clock, the wind had turned into a scream, the kind that makes a house feel smaller, claustrophobic, the kind that makes you double-check every bolt, every latch. Harold went to check the barn, concerned about the livestock, leaving Lily and her younger brother Matt in the living room. It was then they noticed the footprints. Not the usual ones that animals leave, and are pressed into the fresh snow. These were human, or at least they started as human, but wrong. Too long, too wide, as though someone had stretched their feet, making them grotesque. They led from the edge of the woods around the side of the house, stopping just at the kitchen window. Matt, 8 years old and impulsive, wanted to tell his father, but Lily grabbed his arm. "Don't. Not yet." She didn't know why she said it. A part of her just felt wrong about the sound the wind was making out there. It wasn't just wind anymore. It was whispering, murmuring words that seemed almost human, but twisted. Harold returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. "Nothing out there. Just snow and trees. Get some sleep, you two." But sleep was impossible. Every creak in the old farmhouse sounded like footfalls. Every gust of wind sounded like a sigh. By midnight, the phone rang again. This time, Matt answered. "It's..." he began, but the line cut off. The static thickened into voices, overlapping, each whisper a warning, a threat, a plea. Matt dropped the receiver and it skittered across the floor, sliding toward the footprints that had reappeared in the snow outside, closer now, right up to the foundation. Harold's voice trembled when he spoke. "Lily, Matt, stay inside. Lock the doors." They did, but the sense of being watched only grew. The fire flickered and shadows leapt unnaturally, stretching into forms that looked like figures crouched at the corners of the room. Lily swore she saw eyes, black and unblinking, reflected in the window behind her. Around 2 a.m., the power went out. 1 second, the house was lit with the warm orange glow of the furnace and lamps. The next, it was swallowed in darkness. The only light came from the storm outside, lightning flashing occasionally, illuminating the snow and the grotesque footprints that now circled the house in erratic patterns. Harold tried to calm the kids, but his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Stay calm. I'll check the generator." He never returned. Panic set in. Lily grabbed Matt and barricaded themselves in the kitchen, listening as footsteps or the sound of something moving scraped against the siding. The snowstorm muffled normal sounds, but these were sharper, closer, deliberate. The whispers from the phone had stopped, replaced with something else, a low humming, like hundreds of people singing wrong notes at once. The first knock came at the door. Not a polite knock, not someone seeking help. It was slow, heavy, deliberate. Lily's stomach turned. She wanted to run, but where could she go? The storm had claimed every road. Every window looked out into the endless white void, and in that void the shapes moved. Not human shapes exactly. Too tall, too thin, moving in jerks that made no sense. They banged again and again. Each time the hum grew louder, more unbearable. Matt started crying. "They want us," he whispered. "They want us." Lily's heart pounded, but she forced herself to think. She grabbed a knife from the counter, any weapon she could find. She wasn't sure if it would help, but she couldn't sit and wait. Then she noticed the window. The shapes outside were now surrounding the house, their faces pale, skeletal, their mouths opening in ways that seemed to stretch their entire heads. Something had changed. The snow wasn't white anymore. It was darker, streaked with red that glistened in the occasional lightning flash. And then she saw movement in the woods, a figure standing perfectly still, watching. Unlike the others, it didn't move in jerks. It didn't whisper. It just watched. Minutes or hours passed. Time seemed irrelevant. The figures outside, the whispers, the humming, they were all part of something she couldn't name. And then the sound of the front door splintering filled the house. Lily grabbed Matt and ran to the cellar. It was cramped, dusty, and smelled of old potatoes and mold. She pulled the heavy door shut behind them, listening as the upstairs descended into chaos. The wind howled, voices screamed, footsteps ran across the floorboards, and the occasional snap of breaking furniture punctuated the terror. She tried the phone again. Dead. The storm outside seemed to pulse, growl like a living thing. Then she heard it, the sound of her father's voice. Lily, Matt, help. It wasn't coming from the cellar. It was coming from outside, and it wasn't just her father. There were more voices now, calling, pleading, screaming. Something was out there, gathering, forming into something that no human mind should see. Hours passed, or maybe moments. Lily couldn't tell. The wind outside was relentless, carrying the scent of ice, blood, and decay. Then silence, absolute silence. No wind, no whispers, no voices. When she finally dared to open the cellar door, the world outside had changed. The snow had stopped falling, but it was smooth, as if the storm had never happened. The footprints, hundreds of them, led away from the house, deeper into the woods, vanishing near the edge of the property. Harold was gone. Matt was clinging to her, wide-eyed and pale. They never saw him or anyone else from that night again. The neighbors later said the Mortons had vanished without a trace, and when the sheriff went looking, he found nothing in the snow. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. Just the house, standing silently under the cold December sky like a monument to something that had happened but couldn't be explained. Lily and Matt were never found. The farmhouse was eventually abandoned, left to the mercy of the elements. People in Marrow Creek avoid it, especially in December when the wind is strong and the snow thick. Some claim to hear whispers in the distance or see shadows moving across the snow. Every winter, the footprints return, circling the abandoned house, leading into the forest. And every winter, the storm comes, and the wind carries a humming so wrong it makes your bones ache. No one knows who or what comes with it, but the people of Marrow Creek know better than to find out. Some things, they say, don't like to be watched. They don't like witnesses, and they never leave without taking something. Story. The end. The snow started falling around mid-afternoon, thick and fast, coating the small town of Marlow, Maine, in a blanket of white. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the streets were unrecognizable. Cars were buried under piles of snow, streetlights cast hazy halos through the storm, and the wind howled like a living thing through the alleyways. Most residents had retreated indoors, leaving the town almost entirely deserted. Only the brave or foolish ventured outside. Jacob had been driving home from his shift at the local diner, gripping the steering wheel as the storm worsened. The roads had already become slick with ice, and his headlights barely penetrated the heavy snowfall. He had lived in Marlow his entire life, and winter storms were nothing new, but this one felt different. It had an oppressive weight to it, like the snow wasn't just falling, but pressing down on everything, forcing it into silence. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, near the abandoned mill, he realized he couldn't see the road clearly anymore. A sudden drift blocked the narrow street, and he slammed on the brakes. His tires skidded, and the car fishtailed before coming to a shuddering stop against a mound of snow. He cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel tightly. "Great," he muttered to himself. "Just what I needed." He got out of the car, hoping to shove some snow out of the way, and the cold hit him like a wall. The air was sharp, cutting at his face and fingers through his gloves. He tried the radio. Nothing but static. The town's power must have flickered out with the storm. Jacob sighed, rubbing his arms to stay warm, then glanced around. That's when he noticed the figure. It was standing about 30 feet away, partially obscured by the heavy snowfall. At first, he thought it was someone else stranded, maybe another driver. But as he blinked against the wind, he realized it was wrong. The figure didn't move like a person. It was too tall, hunched, and its head seemed oddly small for the width of its shoulders. Its coat, or whatever it was wearing, hung loosely, almost melting into the shadows behind it, and it was staring directly at him. Jacob's stomach sank. "Hey!" he called, trying to sound confident. You okay? The figure didn't move. The wind seemed to swirl around it unnaturally, and a low, almost human growl emanated from somewhere beneath the snow. Jacob stepped back, heart hammering. His instincts screamed at him to run, but the drift of snow behind him blocked his escape. Then the figure started moving. Slowly at first, a deliberate shuffle, its limbs bending in ways that made his skin crawl. It didn't walk, it glided. Or perhaps it just stepped in a way that made the snow beneath it almost absorb the sound of its movement. Jacob stumbled backward, slipping in the snow. God, what the hell are you? He whispered. Before he could react further, a second figure emerged from the blizzard, identical to the first. Then a third. They surrounded him in a loose, widening circle, their heads cocked unnaturally, their faces obscured by hoods or shadow. Jacob's rational mind screamed at him that this couldn't be real, that he was hallucinating from exhaustion and cold, but every instinct in his body told him otherwise. He turned and bolted, snow crunching under his boots, adrenaline giving him impossible speed. Behind him, the figures began moving faster, though they never seemed to run, just slide through the storm toward him. The wind whipped against his face, the snow stinging his eyes, but he didn't dare look back. He could hear the low, guttural sound of them following, almost a whisper in the storm, a voice that wasn't quite human. He stumbled upon the old bridge that crossed the frozen river, half buried in snow. The boards creaked under his weight as he ran. Then one of the figures lunged, or at least Jacob thought it did. There was a moment of pure terror when he thought it had grabbed him, but he realized his jacket had snagged on a branch. Panting, he tore free and sprinted across the bridge, the sound of the others echoing behind him, distorted by the wind. When he finally reached the other side, the figures were gone. He couldn't hear them anymore, and the snowstorm seemed to have died down slightly. Jacob's hands shook as he fumbled for his car keys, teeth chattering uncontrollably. He threw the door open, threw himself inside, and locked the doors. The heater sputtered to life, hot air washing over his freezing skin. He sat there, heart hammering, staring at the blank road ahead, trying to convince himself it was over. But then he noticed something on the windshield. Footprints, too large, too long to be human, trailing through the snow leading up to the passenger side of the car. And they didn't stop at the door. They kept going, straight at him, through the snow outside the glass. Jacob screamed, slammed the car into reverse, and tore down the road, leaving the footprints behind in the growing snow. But even as he sped away, the feeling of being watched never left him. Every shadow along the road seemed to stretch unnaturally, every tree a potential hiding place. When he finally reached the main street of Marlow, the town was silent. Every building shuttered and dark except for the faint glow of the diner where he worked. He ran inside, desperate for warmth, for human contact. The few people inside looked up, confused, as he slammed the door behind him, panting and shaking. "What the hell happened to you?" his coworker asked, but Jacob couldn't answer. Not yet. He couldn't explain it. All he could do was shake, staring out the window into the swirling snow, convinced the figures were still out there, waiting. That night, he tried to sleep in his apartment, but he kept hearing scratching at the windows, whispers in the wind, low guttural murmurs that seemed to echo just outside. He didn't know if they were real or his mind breaking. All he knew was that he couldn't stay. By morning, he packed his car and drove south, away from Marlow, away from the storm, away from whatever had been in the snow. He told no one, fearing he would sound insane, and tried to bury the memory under work and distance. Months later, he learned that other people in the area had reported strange occurrences during that storm. Missing hikers, people hearing voices in the blizzard, strange figures glimpsed through the snow. Some claimed they saw tall, hunched shapes moving through the drifts, always watching, always silent until the storm passed. Local authorities dismissed it as hypothermia-induced hallucinations or pranksters. Jacob didn't believe that. He never went back to Marlow. Every December, when the wind screams across the fields and snow piles against windows, he feels the same icy fear grip him. He dreams of those figures, hunched and silent, gliding through the storm, their eyes hidden but always watching. And sometimes, just sometimes, when he closes his eyes in the dead of winter, he hears a whisper in his ear, low and guttural, saying, "You shouldn't have come." He knows the storm is still out there. He knows the figures are still watching, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to wander into the snow. And he knows he can never truly escape it because those eyes see everything, and the blizzard never forgets. Story the end. The wind had been rising since late afternoon, sweeping down from the mountains with the kind of sharp, slicing cold that felt personal, like it wanted to carve its way through skin and bone. By the time the sun went down, the temperature had crashed to single digits, and the sky had turned the eerie purple of a coming blizzard. December in northern Wyoming was always cold, but that night carried a weight I felt the moment I stepped outside after work, like the air itself was holding its breath. I drove slowly through drifting snow toward the small rental cabin I'd taken for the winter while working a seasonal job at the state wildlife office. It was an isolated place, perched near a line of pine forest that grew thicker the farther it stretched toward the mountains. The nearest neighbor was a half-mile away, and most nights the only sounds were the hum of the heater and the distant groan of shifting ice. But that night wasn't like most nights. I noticed it as soon as I turned onto the narrow road leading up to the cabin. Strange tracks in the snow. Not deer, not elk, certainly not any large predator I knew. I'd studied animal prints for years. They had patterns, logic, predictable spacing. These didn't. They were wide at the front and very narrow at the back, almost like something was balancing on pointed toes. And each print was deeper than it should have been, as if whatever made them was far heavier than the size suggested. My headlights washed over them in brief flashes before the wind erased some of the edges. I slowed the truck, leaning forward to follow the trail. The prints came straight down from the woods, right toward my cabin. A twinge of unease gripped me, but I told myself it had to be some odd boot marks. A hiker? A hunter? People wore strange gear sometimes. Still, I didn't see any parallel prints from trekking poles, no signs of dragging equipment, just a single line of unnatural steps. By the time I reached the cabin, the snow was falling harder, the flakes thick and mean. I parked, grabbed my bag, and hurried inside. The moment I closed the door, I heard the wind howl through the cracks, a long, low moan that rattled the windows. I flicked on the lights and breathed out when the familiar, warm room came into view. Simple, quiet, safe. At least for a little while. I tossed a frozen pizza in the oven and turned on the small TV for background noise. A weather warning ran non-stop along the bottom of the screen. Blizzard conditions expected through morning, temperatures dropping below zero. The kind of night no one should be wandering around outside. Yet those tracks had come from somewhere. I tried to shake off the thought. I'd seen weird prints before. Melting snow distorted shapes easily. It didn't mean anything. But as the wind picked up, I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something move beyond the glass. By the time I finished dinner, the storm had grown fierce enough that the cabin trembled under each gust. I decided to check outside one last time before bed, just to make sure the generator wasn't covered by too much snow. I bundled up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the dark. The world looked like a snow-choked void, everything swirling in frantic white. The beam from my flashlight cut only a few feet ahead. I trudged toward the back of the cabin, boots sinking deep into fresh drifts, and brushed the snow from the generator cover. As I turned back toward the cabin, the light swept over the ground, and I froze. New tracks, fresh ones, leading straight toward the back door. The same strange shape, the same unnatural weight pressing them deep. Every hair on my body stood on end. I swung the light toward the forest, but the storm was too thick to see anything beyond 20 feet. I couldn't spot a shape, couldn't hear anything except the wind, but I felt watched. Not imagined, not nerves. Watched. I backed slowly toward the door, keeping the flashlight aimed at the forest like it was a weapon. When my hand found the doorknob, I yanked it open, stepped inside, and slammed the lock home. My breathing was shallow and fast, fogging up my glasses. I forced myself to take a few breaths, and only when my pulse stopped pounding did I move to the window to look out. Nothing. Only the storm. Inside, the cabin's warmth felt fragile, like a thin shield against the teeth of the night. I turned off the lights to cut the glare and pressed closer to the window, searching for movement. The glass was so cold it burned my fingertips. Minutes passed. The wind screamed. Something banged against the siding, though it might have been just a tree branch. Or not. I retreated from the window and sat on the couch with the TV on low volume, trying to ignore the unease curling tighter in my stomach. But then, around midnight, a sound cut through the storm, a sharp, deliberate knock on the front door. I jerked upright. Knock, knock. Slow, heavy. Not the wind. My throat went dry. I moved silently across the room, careful not to step on the creaking floorboard by the fireplace. When I reached the door, I didn't open it. I pressed my ear gently against the wood. The knocking stopped. A full minute passed. Then, faint but unmistakable, came a voice. "Let me in." My blood froze. The voice was thin, high, cracking with cold, or something else. I couldn't tell if it belonged to a man or a woman, but every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong with it. Something strained, distorted. I stayed perfectly still. Again, the voice whispered a little louder this time. "Let me in, please." No one should have been out in that storm. No one could have walked far in it without freezing. And if someone were genuinely desperate, they'd be shouting, pounding, begging, not whispering, not mimicking. I stepped back from the door, heart hammering against my ribs. The whispering continued, soft and rhythmic, like it was testing the sound of the words, like it was practicing. "Let me in. Let me in." The final words stretched too long, bending unnaturally as if the speaker didn't understand speech so much as imitate it. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The sound must have carried because the whispering stopped. Silence fell, thick, absolute. Then I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, dragging, too heavy for a person. They moved past the front door, toward the window. I didn't know what to do. Run? Hide? Turn off all noise? I backed into the corner near the fireplace and lowered myself to the floor, pulling my knees tight. Outside, something brushed against the house. Long, scraping strokes as if fingers were searching for cracks. The footsteps circled the cabin, sometimes stopping just beneath a window, sometimes sliding across the siding with deliberate slowness. Every time they paused, I held my breath, afraid to even blink. Then came the tapping at the bedroom window. Quiet, barely audible, but there. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't dare look. The thought of a face, or something pretending to have one, staring in from the dark made my vision swim with dizziness. The tapping continued for almost an hour, moving from one window to the next, patient and precise. My bones felt cold, even though the heater ran nonstop. The whole cabin felt smaller, shrinking around me. Finally, sometime after 3 a.m., the sound stopped. No tapping, no footsteps. Even the wind seemed to soften. I didn't move. I stayed curled in the corner until faint light began seeping into the sky. Morning came gray and heavy, the storm finally losing strength. Only then did I force myself to stand. The cabin felt like a crime scene. I moved slowly to the nearest window and pulled back the curtain. The tracks were everywhere. They circled the cabin countless times, deep impressions showing exactly where the footsteps had paused. The snow was scraped away around the windows like something had pressed its face close, searching. And on the porch, right beside the doorframe, were long grooves, 4 parallel lines, each dug inches into the wood. Not claws, fingers. I packed my things within 10 minutes, shoving everything into my truck without bothering to fold or check what I grabbed. I didn't look back at the cabin as I drove away, but I felt eyes on me until the road curved out of sight. I didn't tell my boss the real reason I didn't finish the winter season. I didn't tell anyone what I heard, what I saw. I just left. But sometimes late at night, I hear a similar wind. Thin, high, unnatural, and my skin crawls as the memory returns. I see those tracks circling the cabin, the warped imitation of a voice learning to speak, the long grooves carved into the wood. And I remember one final thing I saw that morning as I backed out of the driveway. Something standing at the tree line, tall, wrong-shaped, perfectly still, watching me leave. Story the end.